March 13, 1945. The Saar, Palatinate Triangle, Western Germany, where the roads and the fields and the defensive positions of the German XIII Corps have been the front line since the autumn, and where the March morning is the morning that the American assault Felber has been projecting as inevitable has arrived. General Hans Felber is watching his front disintegrate at a rate that his most pessimistic planning had not projected. The reports are arriving at intervals that are shortening with every hour, each one carrying the news of a position that has been abandoned by its defenders or overrun before the defenders could organize the resistance that the defensive plan projected as the response. A unit that has lost contact with its neighbors in the specific and ominous way that contact is lost when the neighbor has been cut off, rather than when the communications equipment has failed. A road that is now behind American lines, rather than in front of them. A road that was the rear area 2 hours ago and is now the axis of the American advance, whose pace no German planning has projected as achievable in this terrain. The American Third Army's 12th Corps and the 7th Army's 15th Corps have been pressing the Saar-Palatinate Triangle, the wedge of German-held territory between the Moselle River to the north, the Rhine to the east, and the German-French frontier to the south, since the offensive began on March 13th. And what Felber has been watching for 2 days is not the organized defensive fighting of a German formation executing a planned delay. It is the collapse of a defensive system that has been failing faster than any assessment that the German command produced in the preceding weeks projected as the worst available outcome. The lines on the map are moving east, not at the pace of a fighting withdrawal, whose managed retreat preserves the formation's combat effectiveness for the next defensive position. At the pace of a rout. The German 7th Army, whose sector covers the northern portion of the Saar-Palatinate Triangle, and whose defensive task is the mission that Felber's command has been assigned, is losing units, not to the destruction of the fighting that the American assault is producing, but to the encirclement that the American pace of advance is producing. Units whose communications with the Corps headquarters have been cut, not by artillery fire, but by the American motorized columns that have moved around them, behind them, through the gaps that the German defensive lines' understrength formations have been unable to close. Felber is a professional. He understands what he is seeing, has the analytical training and the operational experience to read the map's changing lines and the shortening report intervals and the unanswered communications as the specific and documented evidence of the operational phenomenon that the German military's professional vocabulary has a precise term for. Zusammenbruch. The collapse, the dissolution of the organized defensive system into the disordered flight of individual soldiers and individual units whose coherence the encirclement's completion has consumed. He understands what he is seeing. He has seen it before, on the other side of the front, in France in 1940 and in Russia in 1941, when it was happening to the Germans' opponents. He has not seen it happening to the German army at this pace, and he has not seen it happening to the German army in a sector whose planning projected the terrain and the formations as capable of the resistance that the collapse's pace is demonstrating as impossible. What he is seeing has not been in any professional assessment that he or his staff or the army group above him has produced for this operation. The Saar-Palatinate operation of March 1945 is the American military's most decisive and most rapid campaign of the entire European theater's operational history. The operation that destroyed the German Army Group G's entire western position in 11 days, that cleared the west bank of the Rhine from Koblenz to the Alsatian border of every German formation capable of organized resistance, that captured approximately 100,000 German prisoners in a campaign whose prisoner-to-American casualty ratio reflects the operational efficiency of an encirclement that prevented the German formations from fighting their way out, at the cost that fighting their way out would have required, and that removed from the war every German formation whose assignment had been the defense of Germany's western approaches in the specific and strategic sector between the Ardennes and the Swiss border, whose defense had been consuming the German military's declining resources since the summer of 1944. It is not well remembered in the popular history of the Second World War's final phase, overshadowed by the drama of the Rhine crossings at Remagen and Oppenheim, and the subsequent drive toward Berlin, that the Saar-Palatinate campaign, made possible by clearing the west bank of the Rhine and destroying the German formations that would otherwise have been available for the Rhine's defense. But for the German commanders whose formations were destroyed in 11 days, 11 days from the operation's beginning to its end, 11 days in which the Triangle's entire German defensive force was captured, or killed, or driven across the Rhine, and for the American commanders whose operational planning produced the campaign's specific and decisive result. It is the campaign that demonstrates most clearly what the American Army had become by March 1945. What the 3 years of organizational development and combat experience and the industrial support of the largest economy in the world had assembled into the operational instrument that the Saar-Palatinate campaign, deployed with the specific and efficient destruction of a German defensive position, that the German planning had assessed as capable of absorbing American pressure for weeks rather than days. General Hans Felber in March 1945 is the commander of the XIII Army Corps, a formation whose assignment in the Saar-Palatinate Triangle reflects the German command's increasingly desperate management of a strategic situation whose deterioration the preceding 6 months have converted from the defense of an established position to the improvised resistance of a formation that is managing the gap between the forces it has and the forces the mission requires, with the professional competence of officers who understand that the gap is not going to close. His corps' assignment in the Saar-Palatinate Triangle is the assignment that the German command's management of the strategic reserve's disappearance and the defensive line's shortening options as the Allied advances on both flanks, Eisenhower's armies from the north and west, and the Red Army's armies from the east, are compressing the German defensive perimeter toward the geographic core that the shrinking German position can still claim, has produced for a corps whose formal organizational strength is substantially larger than its actual fighting strength. Felber is 56 years old, a professional soldier of the German officer corps, whose career has been built through the Reichswehr's professional development and the Wehrmacht's operational campaigns. A corps commander whose specific and documented professional assessment of the military situation is the assessment of a man who has been watching the German army's position deteriorate for 3 years and who has the professional honesty confirmed in his post-war foreign military studies interviews to describe what he witnessed in March 1945 with the accuracy that the professional record requires. He will say after the war, in the foreign military studies interview, whose professional candor reflects the honest assessment of a German officer who is no longer constrained by the institutional requirements of the command structure that was managing the official optimism through the autumn and winter of 1944-45, that the collapse on the Saar happened faster than any report predicted. He will explain why, will identify the specific and operational factors that produced the gap between the projected pace and the actual pace, between the planned response time and the actual response time, between the German defensive capability that the planning assumed and the American offensive capability that the campaign demonstrated. And his explanation will be the most precise available professional account of what happens when the gap between the planned defense and the actual defense becomes too large for the defending formation to manage, too large to be closed by the counterattack whose reserve is insufficient, too large to be compensated for by the terrain whose natural obstacles the American operational pace has outrun, and when the gap is moving too fast for the higher command to respond to it, before the response is already too late. The Saar-Palatinate Triangle, in early March 1945, is one of the last significant German positions west of the Rhine, one of the few remaining geographic bastions whose defense OKW has designated as essential to the strategic concept of a stabilized Western Front, whose coherence has been declining since the Ardennes offensive's failure in January, and whose reality, in the professional assessment of every German corps and army commander in the sector, has already departed from the strategic concept's requirements. The triangle's northern boundary is the Moselle River from Koblenz south to Trier, where the river forms the natural defensive line, whose crossing by the American forces the German defensive planning has identified as the prerequisite for the assault into the triangle's interior. The eastern boundary is the Rhine, the river that Hitler has been designating as the final defensive line since late 1944, and whose crossings the German command has been planning to defend as the last available natural barrier between the Allied forces and the German heartland. The western and southern boundary is the mixed terrain of the Saar-Moselle confluence and the Western Palatinate, where the American forces have been building their offensive positions through February and early March, in the preparation that the German defensive planning has been observing and assessing as the preliminary to the assault, whose timing the preparation's pace has been projecting as imminent. Inside the triangle, Army Group G, under General Paul Hauser, is defending with forces whose strength reflects the cumulative losses of the winter's fighting, the Ardennes offensive's consumption of the strategic reserve, whose commitment to the Ardennes left the Western fronts holding formations without the reinforcements they had been requesting since November, and the systematic degradation of the German army's replacement system, whose output has been failing to keep pace with the casualty rate since the summer's catastrophic losses. These are forces that are, in the professional assessment of every German commander who has examined them honestly, insufficient to hold the position against the scale of American offensive pressure that the Allied command has been accumulating since the Ardennes failure. The American offensive plan, Operation Undertone for the 7th Army's assault from the south and the 12th Corps' pressure driving from the north, is an operational design of considerable sophistication whose specific and documented character is the character of a military command that has been learning how to plan and execute at the operational level since 1942 and whose learning has produced, by March 1945, the institutional capability for the combined arms operation, at scale, that the Saar-Palatinate campaign will demonstrate. The plan exploits the Saar-Palatinate triangle's geographic vulnerability. The fact that a formation inside the triangle that cannot withdraw to the Rhine bridges before the American operational vice closes will be cut off from the Rhine's east bank and destroyed in the pocket that the vice's closure produces, by driving simultaneously from the north and the south at a pace designed to close the vice faster than the German formations can execute the withdrawal that the situation requires. The plan's success depends on the pace exceeding the German withdrawal's pace, which depends on the American armored formations moving faster than the German defensive planning has projected as the maximum achievable pace in the triangle's terrain. The terrain that the German defensive assessment has identified as the natural ally of the defender, whose ridges and valleys and road network limitations the German planning has been incorporating into every timeline of the expected American operational pace. Whether the American formations can achieve the required pace in this terrain, moving faster than the German assessment has projected as achievable, is the operational question whose answer the campaign's first hours will produce, and whose answer will determine whether the Saar-Palatinate triangle's German formations have the time to execute the withdrawal that the only alternative to encirclement requires. The question, at the campaign's beginning on March 13th, is how long the German defensive formation can absorb the pressure before the collapse that the American operational design is producing. Felber's professional assessment, and every German commander's professional assessment in the triangle, is that the collapse will come. The material and manpower disparity between the American forces and the German forces is too great, and the German defensive position's logical isolation from the Rhine's safety is too complete, for the outcome to be anything other than the destruction of the forces inside the triangle. The question is whether the collapse can be managed, whether the withdrawal to the Rhine can be conducted with the professional discipline that preserves the formations for the defense of the Rhine's east bank, or whether the collapse will be the route that Felber's reports, 3 days into the campaign, are telling him it has become. March 13, 1945. The American offensive begins simultaneously from two directions. General Manton Eddy's 12th Corps of Patton's 3rd Army pushes south from the Moselle bridgeheads that the 3rd Army has established since early March, driving into the northern face of the Saar-Palatinate Triangle, with the armored spearheads of the 4th Armored Division, whose commander, Major General William Hoge, has been building the division's operational record since the Lorraine campaign in August. The 4th Armored's columns move south at the pace that the Lorraine campaign established as the 4th Armored's operational signature, the pace of the armored formation that does not wait for the infantry to clear the road, that identifies the gap in the German defensive line and drives through it before the German reserve can close it. That treats the German defensive position not as the line to be fought through in the methodical way of the set-piece assault, but as the perimeter to be bypassed and enveloped and collapsed from within by the operational speed of the armored exploitation, whose depth makes the defense of the forward positions irrelevant. The 4th Armored is also moving simultaneously alongside General Wade Heislip's 15th Corps of the 7th Army, pushing north from the Saar to complete the operational vice, whose closure the two converging advances are designed to produce faster than the German defensive command can respond. Simultaneously, General Wade Heislip's 15th Corps of the 7th Army pushes north from its positions south of the Triangle, the two arms of the American operational vice, beginning the closure that the German formations inside will have 11 days to survive before the vice completes. The German XIII Corps, Felber's command, is positioned in the path of both converging advances, in the specific and operationally exposed location that the German defensive assignment has placed it, and that the American operational design has been planning to exploit since the Saar-Palatinate operation's conception. Felber knows the operational geometry. He has been assessing it. The question is whether the defensive formations in his sector can execute the withdrawal that the geometry requires before the American vice closes the routes through which the withdrawal must pass. March 14, 1945. One day into the operation, the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command B, under Colonel Wendell Blanchard, has moved 25 miles in 18 hours through terrain that the German defensive assessment had identified as the sector most likely to slow the American advance. The Western Palatinate's ridges and valleys, and the forested hills whose defensive terrain value the German planning had been incorporating into its timeline of the expected American operational pace. The terrain whose road network's limitations the German planning had been counting on to constrain the American armored advance to the pace of the road-bound movement, whose speed the terrain governs. The planning was accurate about the terrain's limitations. It was not accurate about whether the 4th Armored Division's operational culture would be constrained by them. Combat Command B has not been constrained. It has been moving through the gaps in the German defensive line with the specific and documented operational energy of an armored formation that has been doing this since Avranches in August, and that has developed the institutional reflexes of exploitation at pace, the reflexes that identify the gap, concentrate the available force, drive through, and keep driving. The German formations in Combat Command B's path are encountering the specific and visceral experience of the armored breakthrough. American tanks on roads that the German defensive plan had not designated as the armored axis, moving faster than the German Corps headquarters' communications can track them, appearing behind positions whose defenders are still oriented toward the front that the American breakthrough has already rendered irrelevant. The near failure of the German response arrives on March 14th, when Felber's XIII Corps attempts the organized counterattack that the German defensive doctrine prescribes for the restoration of a penetrated defensive line. The concentration of the available reserve against the penetration's shoulder, where the attacker's momentum is least, and the defender's counterattack has the best available opportunity to seal the gap before the exploitation extends the penetration beyond the point where sealing is operationally achievable. The doctrine is sound. Its execution requires a reserve whose size and whose mobility and whose readiness to commit are adequate to the gap's size and the gap's movement speed. The reserve that Felber's XIII Corps has available is insufficient on all three measures. Too small in size to seal a gap that the 4th Armored's Combat Command B has already extended to 25 miles. Too slow in mobility to reach the penetration's shoulder before the penetration has moved the shoulder further than the planned counterattack can reach, and committed with a timing that the hours required to organize the counterattack have made too late to be effective at the location where the counterattack arrives. The 2nd Panzer Division, whose available strength is a fraction of its authorized strength after the winter's fighting, after the Ardennes offensive's commitment of its armored reserves, and the subsequent American counteroffensive's consumption of what the Ardennes left, is committed to the counterattack with the specific and documented inadequacy of a formation that is being asked to perform the operational task of a full-strength armored division with the effective strength of a reinforced regiment whose tanks are the surviving vehicles of a division that has been in continuous contact since December. The counterattack is mounted. It meets Combat Command B's armored spearheads in the Western Palatinate's terrain and is repulsed in the specific and visceral way of an armored counterattack that is outgunned, outmanned, and outmaneuvered by the formation it is attempting to stop. Tanks burning in the fields that the 4th Armored's operational advance has been crossing. German armor that arrived at the penetration's shoulder too late to close the gap that the 18-hour advance has already opened beyond the closing. The gap widens. Combat Command B drives south. March 16, 1945. 3 days into the operation, and 2 days after the 4th Armored's Combat Command B has already moved 25 miles through the German defensive position that the planning projected as the slowing terrain, Felber is writing the assessment at his Corps headquarters that will be the most complete professional account of the collapse's speed that the German command system produces. The assessment notes with the specific and professional precision of a document written by a man who has been reading operational situation reports for 40 years that the American pace of advance has exceeded every projection that the German planning produced for the worst-case scenario. The scenario in which the American forces achieved tactical success at their first objective and were able to exploit before the German reserves could be committed. The scenario that the German planning had assessed as producing the most adverse conditions the German defense would face. The worst-case scenario had been assessed as producing a German defensive response time of 2 to 3 days between the American tactical breakthrough and the operational exploitation whose containment required the German reserves' commitment. The American operational success has required 18 hours. 18 hours from the first contact of the assault to the point where Combat Command B's columns are operating in the German rear area that the German defensive planning had designated as the safe zone whose integrity the forward defense was supposed to be guaranteeing. The gap between the planned response time and the actual response time, the gap between the 2 to 3 days the German planning projected and the 18 hours the American operation required, is the specific and operational expression of the gap between the German defensive capability and the American offensive capability that the Saar Palatinate campaign is documenting in the most direct and irreversible available way. The gap between what the German planning assumed the American army could do based on its professional assessment of what armies can do, and what the American army is doing based on what the American army has actually become. Felber's assessment of March 16 says the collapse is happening faster than any report in the German command structure predicted. He is right. His XIII Corps is disintegrating as he writes the assessment that documents the disintegration. Units no longer in contact with the Corps headquarters, positions no longer held by the formations whose defensive assignment was their specific and documented responsibility. The organizational coherence that a Corps command requires for its formations management, dissolving in the specific and irreversible way of a formation that is being encircled faster than it can respond to the encirclement, and being bypassed faster than the command structure can track the bypass. The legacy of General Hans Felber's professional assessment that the collapse on the Saar happened faster than any report predicted, the assessment whose honesty and whose professional precision make it one of the most valuable documents in the Foreign Military Studies Program's collection of German commanders' accounts of the war's final year, is the legacy of the most professionally precise documentation of the gap between German planning assumptions and American operational reality that the European theater's final months produced. It is the document of a professional who has been present for the collapse at the command level, where the collapse's pace is most directly experienced, where the shortening intervals between the reports of lost positions are the specific and immediate evidence of the collapse's speed, where the communications with subordinate commanders that go unanswered are the specific and immediate evidence of the encirclements whose completion has cut those commanders off, and where the maps whose lines are moving east faster than the command's ability to track them are the specific and immediate evidence of the gap between the planned defense and the actual defense. And who has the professional honesty and the analytical rigor to describe what he witnessed without the self-justification and the institutional euphemism that less honest accounts would employ? To say directly that the collapse happened faster than any report predicted, which is the most important professional truth that the Saar-Palatinate campaign's German perspective produces. The Saar-Palatinate campaign ended on March 25, 1945, 11 days after it began. Army Group G had ceased to exist as a coherent military formation. Approximately 100,000 German soldiers had been taken prisoner in 11 days. 100,000 men whose formations had been assessed as capable of holding the Saar-Palatinate Triangle for weeks against American pressure, whose defensive assignments had been the German defensive planning's contribution to the concept of the Western Front's stabilization through the spring, and whose capture in 11 days, rather than weeks, is the specific and documented measure of the gap between what the German planning assumed the American operational capability could produce and what the American operational capability produced. The formations whose assignment had been the defense of Germany's western approaches, the formations whose defensive positions Felber and his fellow commanders had been managing and reinforcing with the insufficient resources that the Ardennes planning's consumption of the strategic reserve had left available, and reporting honestly about in the reports that the German command structure's management of the official optimism had been suppressing since the autumn, were gone. The Rhine was exposed across the entire Saar-Palatinate front. The American forces that crossed it in late March faced not the organized defense of a coherent German position, but the improvised resistance of a German army that had lost its operational coherence west of the Rhine in 11 days, and whose capacity for the organized defense of the East Bank was dependent on the formations that had been destroyed trying to hold the West Bank. The American casualties in the Saar-Palatinate campaign, approximately 3,000 killed and wounded across the 6 divisions that conducted the main effort against the 100,000 German prisoners taken, are the measure of how efficient the American operational design had become by March 1945, and how ineffective the German defensive capability had become by March 1945. The ratio of prisoners to American casualties is approximately 33 to 1. It is not a ratio that military campaigns typically produce. It is the ratio of an operation that was won at the operational level before it was fought at the tactical level, won by the operational design that closed the vice faster than the German formations could escape it, by the armored exploitation that moved at a pace the German defensive planning had not projected as achievable, and by the institutional learning of an American military that had been developing the capability to produce this specific result since 1942, and that deployed it with the full and devastating efficiency of a force that had finally become what the 3 years of organizational development had been building it toward. What Felber's assessment documents, in the specific and professional language of a German corps commander who has watched his formations destroyed in 11 days, and who has been present for the collapse at the command level, where the collapse's pace is most legible as the operational phenomenon it represents, is not simply the tactical failure of the German defensive positions in the Saar-Palatinate Triangle. It is the systemic failure of the German military's understanding of the American operational capability, the 3-year accumulation of a professional misassessment that had been producing, from Tunisia through Sicily, through Normandy, through the Lorraine campaign, through the Ardennes, a consistent pattern of German planning that underestimated what the American army could do when it had the material abundance and the operational coordination and the institutional learning of 3 years of increasingly effective combined arms warfare behind it, and when the German defensive position lacked the reserve depth to absorb the breakthrough's exploitation. The German professional tradition's assessment of the American army in 1944 and 1945 was not unintelligent, was not the assessment of a professional class that was blind to the American capabilities, or that was dismissing them from the institutional arrogance of a military tradition that could not see past its own doctrinal assumptions. The German officers who produced the Foreign Military Studies interviews, Felber among them, along with the dozens of German generals and colonels whose post-war accounts the American Army collected as the systematic documentation of the war from the German professional perspective, were among the most analytically rigorous military professionals of their generation. They saw the American capabilities clearly. They saw the American logistical system's scale and its specific and industrial capacity to sustain the offensive at rates that the German supply system could not match. They saw the American individual initiative at the tactical level, whose expression in the Arcourt tank battles and the Bastogne defense and the Rhine crossings, the German professional record documents, with the consistent and professional observation that the American soldiers' individual decision-making was not constrained by the doctrine in the way that the German planning's model of the American opponent projected. They saw the American armored formations pace and the operational culture that the Third Army's formations had been developing since August 1944. What they did not fully accommodate in their planning, what the planning consistently failed to project at the correct scale, was the cumulative effect of all of those capabilities operating simultaneously, coordinated at the operational level by an American command system that had been learning how to make them work together since Tunisia in 1943, and that by March 1945 had assembled the operational instrument that the Saar-Palatinate campaign deployed. The collapse happened faster than any report predicted, because the reports were measuring the American Army's capability against the German professionals' understanding of what armies can do, against the baseline of what the German Army at its best could achieve in the mobile exploitation, against the benchmark of Guderian's Panzer advance in France in 1940, that was the German professionals' reference point for what armored exploitation's maximum pace looks like. The reports were accurate about the German Army at its best in 1940. They were not accurate about the American Army at its best in 1945, because the American Army at its best in 1945 was not the American Army that the reports had been written about. It was the army that had been learning from 1943 to 1945 how to combine armor and infantry and artillery and air support and logistics at the operational level, and whose learning had produced by March 1945 the institutional capability for the combined arms operation at the scale and pace that the Saar-Palatinate campaign deployed. The front does not care what the report says. It moves at the pace that the force opposing it can produce. And in March 1945, in the Saar-Palatinate triangle, the force opposing it could produce a pace that no report in the German command structure had predicted, because no report in the German command structure had been built on a full understanding of what the American Army had become. Felber understood this when he wrote his assessment on March 16th from the Corps headquarters, whose communications traffic was documenting the collapse in real time. He had watched what the American Army had become for 11 days, had watched it from the inside of the collapse, from the command level, where the gap between the planned defense and the actual defense is most directly and most painfully experienced in the shortening intervals between the reports and the unanswered communications, and the maps whose lines move east faster than the plan. He never forgot what he saw. And the German army that was destroyed in the Saar-Palatinate triangle in 11 days never had the opportunity to forget it either.